Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Thank you so much for joining this discussion today. I'm Cesar Solomon, Executive Vice President with Teleperformance and Chair of our Latinx at Teleperformance Employee Resource Group and proud member of our Black at Teleperformance Employee Resource Group. And I'm joined today by the incredible Libra Clemens, Chief Diversity Officer for Twilio. And we're going to have an important discussion today. We're going to talk about some topics that are very near and dear to both of our hearts. We'll touch on racism, racist policies, and how we can eliminate racism from our organizations. We'll talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, and the role that each of us can play in addressing these roles. So with that said, I'd like to thank you, Libra, so much for taking the time out to have this discussion today. And I figure we can jump in with a little bit of a background and talk a little bit about our stories and why this topic is so important and near and dear to both of our hearts.
Yeah. So, first of all, it's loaded for only a short amount of time, but I think we can get this going. So, I have been in the diversity space for about 15 or 20 years. And so I have seen the evolution of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And everybody knows what happened in 2020. Beyond the global pandemic, we had a global pandemic on top of a global pandemic. And there was a lot of racial unrest and racial reckoning. A little late for a lot of people, but it was happening. And the world finally took a beat and was like, we got to focus on this. Companies were scrambling. You and I, we worked at companies. They were scrambling, trying to figure out, how do we address this? How much money do we give to organizations? How do we shift our policies? Do we have all the right diversity, equity, inclusion policies in place? So I joined Twilio shortly after in August 2020. And Twilio was a company that said, we're committed to becoming an anti-racist organization. I was on board. I was like, this sounds fabulous, until we realized, what is that? What is being an anti racist organization? Nobody has done this before. What does that mean? And Caesar, we've had conversations around, like, what does that really mean? This is new. Anti racism is not a new idea, but conceptually in the workplace, it's new for the workplace. And I saw a lot of companies trying to figure out how they were going to reckon with racism, and something that we've all tried before. And so Twilio, amongst other companies, decided they wanted to shift their focus, because diversity and equity inclusion are programs, they're trainings, there's, the business case. Anti-racism is personal. These are personal journeys and leadership transformations that we all have to go to reckon with racism. And so our team spent some time. We read Ibram Kendi's book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, and we dissected it and tried to figure out, how do we apply that to our corporate policies, our corporate practices, and so forth. It feels different from what we did years ago with diversity, equity, inclusion. It's a close cousin of diversity, equity, inclusion, but it's less about the programs, which are fabulous and foundational. It's less about the programs. It's less about the training. It's more, and the interventions, it's more about the personal decisions that you make. So, Caesar, we've been talking about this a while, and you have a very interesting story as well. Would love to hear your background, and then we could talk a little bit more about how this shows up in terms of racism in the workplace.
Absolutely. Thank you, Libra. And I'll tell you, you mentioned something that stood out to me, and it was around it being personal, it being something that is true to ourselves and that really impacts our lives. And so when I was sitting down preparing for this discussion today, one of the themes that kept coming to mind was tell your truth, speak your truth, right? These topics that we'll talk about affect millions of people, but they certainly affected us as individuals. And so a little bit about my background and my story. So my parents are from the Dominican Republic. They moved to the United States in the 70s in search for a better life for them and their family. So I was born and raised in New York, in the Bronx. And as a first generation Dominican American, as a proud Afro Latino, all of these topics really played a role in my growth and development, both on a personal front and on a professional front. So I think back on my development, my growth, me coming up in my career. And when in the moment, I didn't recognize and realize these things, but with the benefit of hindsight, I look back and I think about the early days of my career where I'd be in meetings, and oftentimes I was the youngest person in the room. Oftentimes I was the only one that looked like me in the room. And again, you didn't think much of it, or I didn't at the time, but how that impacts your psyche, how it impacts the way you show up, it really is important, and it matters, and it did impact it. So I think about from me consciously trying to neutralize my accent, as an example, to changing my speech patterns, right? And feeling like I had to assimilate to what I felt at the time was what you needed to be in order to be successful, right? To even to the point where I would put thought into what type of haircut I would get before a meeting. And so these things really play a role in your psyche. And of course, as you mature, as you grow, as you develop, you realize that in order to be your best self, you have to be your genuine self. You have to be true to who you are. And so, of course, you gain that insight along the way. But boy, do I wish that I can go back and I had the examples and the mentorship and the leadership where I could have learned those lessons earlier in my life, right? So, naturally, if you eventually get to a point, and certainly this is my story in terms of what happened with me, but you get to a point where you realize that it's okay to be your genuine self. It's okay to be you and to be who you are unapologetically. And that nothing was given to me. I earned a seat at that table, right? So that paradigm shift, that mind shift plays a huge role in then your ability to continue to drive, your own growth and development personally and professionally. But I'd also be remiss not to mention a couple of facts, and that there are factors in our society at large and in organizations that result in an uneven playing field, right? And some of those factors, from the historical lack of investments in certain communities, in quality education, in healthcare, in diversity among leadership organizations and leadership teams, it matters who's sitting in the room when decisions are being made. And so all of these things manifest themselves in a variety of ways, from the historical wealth inequality, from pay gaps and pay inequality, socioeconomic factors. These are all these things that are important and they're real. And so I think it's important for us to acknowledge those things, to talk about those things, because that's the only way we're going to make progress as a society to address them.
I love that. And one of the things I think is super critical, I want to bring this back to what we talk about, like becoming an anti-racist organization, are decisions, conscious decisions that are being made. So Ibram Kendi, who I just mentioned, is the author of the book, How to Be an Anti-Racist. And he put it best by saying, being anti-racist results from a conscious decision to make frequent, consistent, equitable choices daily. These choices require ongoing self-awareness and self-reflection as we move through life. Being racist or anti-racist is not about who you are, it's about what you do. And I want to bring it back because we talk about decisions, and I want to kind of close it off by saying, yes, everyone has a story. I love your story. I have a story. I know what it's like to be a Black woman and to really be at a senior level role and sit at the table, to your point, and contribute to making decisions. But this is bigger than us. These are people that wake up every day, and some of them don't have the luxury, they have the luxury of not even thinking about what it's like to be a marginalized community. But when you become an anti-racist, it's not about who you voted for or saying, oh, I have a friend that is X, Y, and Z. It's about those conscious decisions that you are making every single day that promote equity. So when I think about that in the company perspective, when I think about our policies and practices, when you're thinking about your compensation policies and practices, when you're thinking about, are you remote? Are you moving? Are you telling people to come back to the office? Are you thinking about this with an equitable lens? Are you thinking about the people who can't afford to live in those cities, people who can't afford to commute, those folks who can't afford to live in certain cities where there's access to high paying jobs? So when I think about that, and I think about kind of your experience, my experience, we are part of the voices that's helping to shape it. But we also have to work with others to ensure that there is self-awareness and self-reflection so that they can continue to make decisions that promote equity for people like us. So I would just love to hear your thoughts about that as we close out.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is, you're spot on, first and foremost, right? It's our obligation, I feel, to broaden the discussion, to make sure that we're bringing in and factoring in different perspectives. That's why I mentioned that it's important who's in the room when decisions are being made, because there are decisions that are made, there are policies out there who perhaps, or which perhaps on their face are not discriminatory or are not racist policies, for example. But if those policies in its execution and in its actual net effect have are executed differently or affect certain groups of people differently, then that's the type of policy that we need to be dissecting to understand, while not being, while perhaps a benign policy on the surface, does it affect different groups within our organization differently? And so you're spot on that when we do assessments as organizations and we assess the lay of the land and where are we in our policies in alignment with our equity and inclusion and anti-discriminatory efforts, we have to really look under the hood. We have to look in the mirror. We have to be honest with ourselves, and we have to say, what does our promotion process look like? What does our appraisal process look like? What does our recruiting process look like? And we have to be deliberate with those efforts, or else we will continue to make decisions and policies that negatively impact groups of people, particularly marginalized communities, underrepresented communities, and would be then still patting ourselves on the back saying, hey, we're making progress on this front. But it's with that clear eye, with that open mind, and looking at it through the lens of ensuring that all of our policies are non-discriminatory, that we'll be able to help drive within the workplace, at least, an environment that fosters diversity, an environment that people are comfortable coming into work.
Finally, I would love to hear from you. What do you think the future of work will be now that we're thinking about this evolution of diversity, equity, inclusion, and anti-racism? I do this with our teams all the time, kind of this future. What does a future organization look like?
Well, first off, great question. Secondly,
and by the way, I don't know the answer, but but I'm curious.
Yeah, well, I'll tell you this, right? So, when I think about the future, first, let me acknowledge the past. The fact that we're in this conversation today, the fact that we're privileged and blessed to have this platform to be able to help advance this cause is a testament to all of the hard work of folks that came before us. We're standing on their shoulders. So when I think about the future, I'll answer your question through the lens of future from a generational standpoint, right? I think every generation helps to make progress and help make the world a more equitable and fair place. And so I'm one of 6 children, right? I am the youngest of 6. I have 5 brothers and sisters. Through them, I have 18 nephews and nieces. So it's very personal to me. And it hits even closer to home because I have a baby girl on the way and she's due to join us next month. And I want to live in a world where my daughter, my nephews and nieces can be comfortable in their own skin, that they don't have to worry about, are they going to be judged by the color of their skin, the texture of their hair? So I want to help drive an environment that fosters that, but also that helps them avoid some of the painful lessons that we've had to learn along the way and that plenty of generations before us had to really go through. And so privilege from that sense, but I think that it's going to be a never-ending effort, right? We'd be kidding ourselves and we'd be naive to think that the world is going to change overnight. But it's through having these types of conversations, both with like-minded people, but also, and perhaps more importantly, with folks who don't share our worldview, right? And who perhaps have different opinions. And being able to be comfortable having uncomfortable discussions is how we progressively make progress and chip away at it, right? And beyond that, right, then it's some of the structural things, right? Because what I just described is more of the impactful on a one-to-one basis or on a one-to-few basis. But I'm talking, there are also efforts and actions that we have to take at a societal level with our laws and our policies and the way that we engage and invest in our communities. And then there's the structural items within organizations, like what you're doing at Twilio and what we're doing at Teleperformance, which is very hyper focused on ensuring that we have an even playing field amongst all of our policies, and that we also help to right some of the wrongs, the historical wrongs, by creating an environment that has that access and that even playing field. So I'd love your thoughts on the same question.
Yeah, I mean, I will close and say I 100% agree with all that. In the near future, I would like other people to have this conversation. The chief diversity officer is so expected. Why am I having this conversation? I think this is a conversation that CEOs need to have with each other. CEOs that, not assuming that all CEOs are white males, but I think about those from a majority group. They're having these thoughtful conversations about this, as they would with Business Insider or Financial Times or any other group around business, that they're having thoughtful, unscripted conversations about this and their personal journeys. And that's what I like about anti-racism, again, because it is a self-reflection, self-awareness, personal journey of approaching anti-racism.
I love that. And,
yeah.
And I was just going to say that's what makes it real, right? And it's what I want to, this is always top of mind to me. I don't want to have conversations around diversity, equity, and inclusion, or anti-discrimination and anti-racism, and it be a check the box type of mentality where it's like, oh, do you have ERGs? Yes, check. Do you have, a DE&I campaign? Yes, check. It needs to be real, and it needs to be a part of what we live and breathe every day, and we have to embed it into the core of our organization consistently. And to your point, it starts at the top, but it has to be pervasive throughout the entire organization.
Absolutely. You said it best. I think that was the best summary of it all. This was great. I so enjoyed this. I know we're going to continue these conversations at some point because we got so many people in common. So I appreciate connecting with people who help me to think about this differently. We're constantly hanging out with like-minded people. We are like-minded. But I think what I loved about your assessment of us is kind of bringing the worldview into it. I'm kind of stuck in like, what can I do from the company perspective? And I love the broader impacts that you mentioned around like healthcare, socioeconomic access. All of that I think is super critical. So thank you for this. And thanks to everybody for having Caesar and I do this wonderful conversation.
Awesome. Well, it's been my absolute pleasure. I'm grateful for you to take the time out. I consider you an expert in this space. So really,
you too.
So I really appreciate you, and I hope you have an amazing rest of your week.
Thank you.